South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol is backing down, saying that he's going to lift his martial law order. And this comes after the country's parliament voted to unanimously block that decree that he had made, and after the president's own party urged him to drop it.
Yeah, that declaration led to huge swarms of protesters hitting the streets of Seoul, demanding that he lift the order, many demanding the president's resignation. Let's go live to the scene in South Korea's capital with CNN's Mike Valerio. Mike, what are you seeing?
Well, we're seeing people in shock and dismay occupying this block, which is right in front of the National Assembly. One of the scenes where this drama played out, where, as you mentioned, all the members of the National Assembly, or many of the members of the National Assembly, come back and unanimously vote to overturn and suspend martial law instituted here in South Korea. So let's push in, show you some of these protesters. There were hundreds of people before. You know, when we were on Boris and Brianna earlier in the evening, I would say about 3 hours ago, we saw two military vehicles that were trying to get out of here. One of the pieces of good news that we've been able to report since we were on the air, we saw troops, members of the military, who were positioned up and down this street. Again, one of the main streets of Seoul, one of the main avenues looking to the beautiful National Assembly. All of those military assets seem to have dispersed after that unanimous decision from the parliament, and after we heard from South Korea's president that, yep, he was going to back down. Now, what we're waiting for, the cabinet has to come in of the presidential administration and simply give the rubber stamp and say, okay, this is all over. But it seems to be, you know, a palpable sigh of relief. People still honestly befuddled, Boris and Brianna, of how this happened. We have the South Korean president giving a speech over live TV, unannounced, saying that from his point of view, pro-North Korean and anti-state forces were working to overturn the government and infiltrate the state. And we're all kind of wondering, what is he talking about? Very unclear, no specific pieces of evidence, and people who you talk to are wondering similar things. How did the president even decide this? How did he take us down this path? It's such a sensitive, of course, tributary of South Korean history wrapping up here, because this is the first time since 1980 that martial law was instituted right after the Korean War. This is a place where dictators ruled, essentially. We have 28,500 American troops who are spread throughout the country, a crucial American ally. Stability here is key, so we seem to be breathing a sigh of relief, but need to hear from the president about why he did this and what is next, Boris and Brianna.
Yeah, and Mike, what about his future? He's so unpopular, as you have noted in your reports. Can he survive this politically?
You know, so many rules of politics have been rewritten over the past couple of years. It seems unlikely that he will be able to survive, but his critics would say that he does thrive on drama and taking a tough stand, especially against North Korea, and being a fighter. So who knows? Unable to answer that question before the sun rises. If he will resign, so many people want him to. Will he survive? It seems unlikely. But we're buckling up here in East Asia. It remains to be seen.
Mike Valerio with the latest from Seoul. Thank you so much for that update. Let's bring in CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David, thank you so much for being with us. One of the outstanding questions here is why South Korea's president would have taken this step of declaring martial law if he had all suspected that his National Assembly, including the members of his own party, even the leader of his own party, would vote unanimously to overturn that declaration. What was he trying to accomplish?
You know, it's a real mystery, because it does seem as if he has made one of the great political errors you possibly could. Now, I covered South Korea back in the days when martial law was coming to an end in the 1980s. And the population does not want to go back to that age when even the first presidents who were elected were former generals. And so the transition to a true democracy and to becoming the world's 12th largest economy, which is South Korea's position today, is something that South Koreans of both parties cherish. And so how he thought he was going to get away with this is a mystery to me, especially because, as one U.S. official noted to me, in his initial statement 5 or 6 hours ago, there was no mention of North Korea, of a threat to the sanctity of the state of South Korea. This was all about a way to resolve political gridlock.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, how is the U.S. viewing this, David? Because a stable and democratic South Korea is so important to America when it comes to commerce, when it comes to its alliances and its power in the Asia-Pacific region. How are U.S. officials reacting?
Well, first, they were shocked, Brianna, because they had gotten no advance notice of this. Which is, violation of rule number 1 with your major allies. Second, they viewed it initially as a huge embarrassment to President Biden, who in March of 2023 invited South Korea to be one of the co-sponsors of one of the White House democracy summits. And the agenda called for countering authoritarianism. So martial law doesn't exactly fit into that. You may recall that the Biden administration, to its credit, brought South Korea and Japan together to help counter China and, of course, North Korea, and considered that one of its major accomplishments in the Indo-Pacific. And that was an initiative that ran through with President Yoon. But they were clearly worried about him, just because of the question of his political unpopularity. They were shocked today. I had text messages from administration officials who said their public statements were going to be pretty mild so that they could leave the president room to back down, President Yoon room to back down. And that's exactly what he did. And, we'd all love to hear what those private messages to him were.
David, I'm curious about the veracity of his claims, his justification for installing martial law, one of them being that pro-North Korean operatives had infiltrated the state apparatus. Now, we've seen North Korea conduct some international operations before. I think that the Sony hack is one example. Kim Jong-un going after family members abroad, murdering family members abroad. But is that a legitimate concern for the South Korean government?
Well, as I mentioned before, the statement said nothing about the stability of the South Korean state. So are there North Korean operatives or sympathizers in South Korea? Yes, of course. Have there been since the war ended in 1953? Yes, of course there have been. And so what he didn't do was make the connection about whether or not those influences were actually a true threat to South Korea. And, the only threat to South Korea from the North that I can see is a nuclear one, right? The North now has 60 or more nuclear weapons. Even mounting a conventional attack across the DMZ would be hard for North Korea. So this seemed more like pretense in order to get the upper hand in what I described before as political gridlock than any real threat to the South Korean state. And in fact, I can recall many other moments when I think South Korea's nascent democracy was more threatened in the late 80s and early 90s than it is today.